James was a struggling farmer who owned nothing of value except an old winter coat his father had given him. One freezing December evening, he found a shivering boy lost in his snow-covered fields. Without hesitation, James wrapped his only coat around the child's shoulders, knowing he'd have to face the bitter winter nights without it. Little did he know, this simple act of kindness would change his life forever. The next day, a military helicopter landed in his wheat field. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. His small farm had been in the family for 3 generations, though these days it was barely keeping afloat. The harsh winters and dropping crop prices had taken their toll, but James wasn't one to complain. He worked from sunrise to sunset, trying to preserve the legacy his grandfather had started in Pine Valley, Montana, where the Miller family name had once meant something. The farmhouse told its own story of struggle and perseverance. Paint peeled from its weathered walls, and the roof needed repairs James couldn't afford. Inside, he kept warm with a wood stove, saving every penny he could for seeds for the next planting season. His father's old coat, worn but sturdy, was his most treasured possession, a reminder of the man who had taught him everything he knew about farming and life before passing away while James was deployed overseas. The coat itself was nothing special to look at. Dark brown canvas with a wool lining, patches on both elbows, and brass buttons that had long lost their shine. But to James, it was priceless. He could still remember his father wearing it every winter morning, heading out to milk the cows or check on newborn calves. Now it was James's turn to wear it, carrying on traditions that seemed to be fading as fast as the small farms around him were being sold off to big agricultural companies. Before the war in Afghanistan, James had dreamed of modernizing the farm, making it as prosperous as it had been in his grandfather's day. But 3 tours as a combat engineer had changed him. He'd returned with a purple heart, a limp from an IED blast, and a deeper appreciation for the simple things in life. His military pension helped keep the farm running, but just barely. Some nights, lying awake listening to the wind howl through the drafty windows, he wondered how much longer he could hold on. The locals respected James not for his military service, which he rarely discussed, but for his unwavering willingness to help others despite his own hardships. He was known for sharing his meager harvest with struggling families, helping neighbors repair their farm equipment, and teaching young kids about farming at the local school. Even when the bank threatened foreclosure last spring, he'd still found ways to help others, believing that wealth wasn't measured by money in the bank, but by the good you did for others. Winter had come early this year, harsh and unforgiving. The kind of cold that seeped into your bones and stayed there. James had been forced to sell most of his livestock, keeping only 2 dairy cows and a few chickens. Every morning he would don his father's coat, the warmth as much emotional as physical, and trudge through the snow to tend to what remained of his farm. His daily routine was a testament to his determination. Up before dawn, he'd start the wood stove and make coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, just like his father used to. Then, he'd head out to milk the cows, feed the chickens, and check the ancient tractor that somehow kept running through sheer willpower, and his own mechanical skills learned from maintaining military vehicles. The farm's fields, once rich with wheat and corn, now lay mostly dormant under the snow. James had managed to plant only half his usual acreage this year, lacking the funds for enough seed and fertilizer. Still, he maintained the fences, cleared the paths, and kept everything as ready as possible for better days he hoped would come. Most evenings found him at his kitchen table, poring over bills by lamplight to save on electricity. The local agricultural cooperative had offered to buy him out more than once, but James always declined. This land meant more to him than money. It was where his grandfather had first settled after World War II, where his father had taught him to drive a tractor when his feet could barely reach the pedals, and where he'd hoped to pass on the farming tradition to the next generation, though that dream seemed more distant with each passing season. What James didn't know was that tomorrow would bring more than just another cold dawn. It would bring a helicopter carrying someone with direct ties to his military past, and an opportunity that would test everything he believed about loyalty, service, and the true value of a simple act of kindness. The choice he would have to make would challenge not just his future, but everything he thought he knew about his past. The day that would change everything started with an unusual silence, the kind of quiet that comes with heavy snowfall, when the world seems muffled and distant. The temperature had dropped well below zero, and the Weather Service was warning of one of the worst winter storms in Montana's recent history. James had spent the morning reinforcing the barn doors against the coming storm, his fingers numb despite his work gloves. His father's coat provided some protection against the bitter wind, but he could feel winter's bite through the worn fabric. The coat's familiar weight brought comfort, though, a reminder of stronger times, when the farm had been prosperous and the Miller name had meant something in Pine Valley. By late afternoon, the snow was falling so heavily that the fence line at the edge of his property had disappeared into the whiteness. James had just finished securing the last of his animals in the barn, making sure they had enough feed to last through the storm. The two remaining dairy cows, Belle and Daisy, watched him with patient eyes as he double-checked their water supply. They were all he had left of what had once been a respectable herd. His old military instincts had kicked in early that morning, leading him to prepare methodically for the incoming storm. Extra firewood stacked by the stove, emergency lamps checked and filled with oil, batteries replaced in the portable radio. The habits formed during his tours as a combat engineer, always plan ahead, always prepare for the worst, had served him well in civilian life. The kitchen clock showed 4:30 p.m., but the sky outside was already darkening. Winter days were short in Montana, and this storm was making them shorter. James stood at his kitchen window, nursing a cup of coffee and watching the snowfall. The radio crackled with updates about road closures and warnings for people to stay indoors. His neighbor, old Bill Henderson, had called earlier to check if James needed anything, a common courtesy among farmers in these parts. As he scanned his snow-covered fields, movement caught his eye. At first, he thought it might be a deer. They sometimes wandered close to the house during bad weather. But something about this movement seemed different, more purposeful. James grabbed his binoculars from their spot near the window, a habit from his military days that he'd never shaken. Through the swirling snow, he could make out a figure moving unsteadily across his lower field. The person seemed small, possibly a child, and was clearly struggling against the wind and deep snow. They weren't dressed for this weather. James could see that, even from this distance. His heart rate quickened as he realized the danger. In these temperatures, without proper protection, someone could freeze to death in minutes. Without hesitation, James grabbed his father's coat and headed for the door. The blast of cold air that hit him as he stepped outside nearly took his breath away. The snow was falling so heavily now that he could barely see 10 feet ahead. He began moving toward where he'd last seen the figure, using the fence line as a guide. The wind howled around him, finding every gap in his clothes. Without his father's coat, he was much more vulnerable to the cold, but that thought barely registered. His military training took over. Focus on the mission, ignore the discomfort, move with purpose. His old injury made walking through the deep snow difficult, but he pressed on. He called out several times, his voice swallowed by the wind. The snow had soaked through his pants, and he could feel the cold seeping into his boots. Still, he continued searching, methodically covering ground just as he'd done when searching for IEDs in Afghanistan. After what seemed like an eternity, but was probably only minutes, he heard something. A faint cry carried on the wind. Following the sound, James finally found him. A boy, couldn't have been more than 12, huddled against a fence post. The child's jacket was thin, completely inadequate for this weather, and he was shivering uncontrollably. His lips had started to turn blue, and his eyes were unfocused, early signs of hypothermia that James recognized from his survival training. Without a word, James stripped off his father's coat and wrapped it around the boy. The cold hit him immediately, but he ignored it. The boy tried to protest weakly, but James was already scooping him up in his arms. "I'm James Miller," he said, raising his voice above the wind. "You're going to be okay. Just hold on." The trek back to the farmhouse was grueling. Every step was a battle against the wind and snow, and without the coat's protection, the cold cut through James like a knife. His old wound screamed in protest, but he kept moving, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. The boy in his arms had stopped shivering, a dangerous sign, but was still conscious, clutching the coat tightly around himself. James could feel himself weakening as they finally reached the farmhouse. His fingers were so numb he struggled with the door handle, but eventually managed to get them inside. The warmth of the wood stove hit them like a wave as he carried the boy to his recliner, positioning him near the heat. What James didn't know as he worked to warm the boy up was that this act of kindness would set in motion a chain of events that would reach all the way back to his time in Afghanistan. He couldn't have known that the next morning, as the storm cleared, a military helicopter would appear over his fields, carrying someone who had been searching for him for a very long time. Inside the warmth of the farmhouse, James moved with practiced efficiency, drawing from both his military medical training and years of handling emergencies on the farm. He wrapped the boy in additional blankets, careful not to warm him too quickly, a lesson learned during cold weather survival training. The ancient wood stove crackled reassuringly, pushing back the winter chill that had followed them inside. The boy, still wearing James's father's coat beneath the blankets, gradually began to show signs of improvement. Color returned to his face, and his breathing became more regular. James prepared hot chocolate, real milk from his own cows, not the powdered stuff, and waited until the boy seemed strong enough to talk. "I'm Tommy," the boy finally said, his hands wrapped around the steaming mug. "Tommy Chen." His voice was clearer now, though still shaky. "I was trying to take a shortcut home from school when the storm got worse. I got lost. Couldn't see anything in the snow." James nodded, remembering similar whiteout conditions during his deployment in the mountains of Afghanistan. "You're lucky I saw you from the window," he said quietly. "In weather like this, being lost can turn deadly fast." He didn't mention that he'd been watching his fields out of habit, scanning for threats just as he'd done thousands of times overseas. As Tommy warmed up, James noticed something about the boy's features that stirred a memory. There was something familiar in the shape of his eyes, the set of his jaw. It nagged at the edge of his consciousness, like a word he couldn't quite recall. "Your last name's Chen?" James asked carefully. "Any relation to Captain David Chen?" The name had haunted him for years, the officer who'd saved his unit during a particularly brutal ambush, but who'd been transferred before James could ever thank him properly. Tommy's eyes widened. "That's my dad. How did you know him?" Before James could respond, the phone rang, the landline he kept for emergencies since cell service was spotty this far out. It was Tommy's parents, frantic with worry, and calling every farm in the area looking for their son. James gave them directions to his farm, assured them Tommy was safe, and hung up. "Your father," James said, turning back to Tommy. "He was a good man, a great officer." He paused, memories flooding back. "He saved my life once and the lives of my entire unit. Never got to thank him properly." Tommy listened intently as James told him about the ambush, about how Captain Chen had led a rescue operation through impossible conditions to extract James's trapped unit. "Dad never talks about his military days," Tommy said softly. "But sometimes I hear him having nightmares about something that happened near the end of his tour." James fell silent, knowing exactly which nightmares Tommy meant. The rescue operation had succeeded, but Captain Chen had been wounded in the process. He'd been evacuated immediately afterward, and James had never learned what happened to him. The sound of approaching vehicles cut through the storm, Tommy's parents arriving. James helped Tommy up, noticing that the boy was still wearing his father's coat. "Keep it," James said when Tommy tried to return it. "It's too cold out there and you've got to ride home now." Tommy hesitated, looking at the worn coat. "But isn't it special to you? I heard you talking to yourself earlier about it being your father's." James smiled, though there was a touch of sadness in it. "It is special, But my father always said the value of a thing isn't in owning it, but in how you use it to help others. He straightened the coat on Tommy's shoulders. He would have wanted you to have it. The reunion between Tommy and his parents was emotional. James stood back, watching from his porch as they hugged their son. He recognized Tommy's mother from somewhere too, but couldn't place her. As they prepared to leave, Tommy's father turned to thank James but stopped short when he saw his face in the porch light. There was a moment of recognition, a flash of something in the man's eyes, but before anything could be said, they were hurrying to their car, eager to get home before the storm worsened. James watched their taillights disappear into the swirling snow, fighting the urge to call out, to say something about that day in Afghanistan. Later that night, unable to sleep despite his exhaustion, James sat by his wood stove wearing an old military surplus jacket he'd found in his closet. It wasn't nearly as warm as his father's coat, but it would do. He thought about Captain Chen, about Tommy, about all the threads of past and present that seemed to be weaving together in ways he couldn't yet understand. What James didn't know was that at that very moment, in a warm house on the other side of Pine Valley, Tommy was telling his father about the former soldier who had saved him, about the stories of Afghanistan, about the precious coat he'd been given. And Captain David Chen, now a high-ranking official in a classified military program, was making a phone call that would bring a helicopter to James Miller's farm with the dawn. The night after rescuing Tommy passed slowly for James. The storm raged outside, rattling the farmhouse's old windows and whistling through every crack. Without his father's coat, the cold seemed to seep deeper into his bones. He kept the wood stove burning hot, feeding it precious logs from his dwindling supply, his thoughts drifting between past and present. Sleep proved elusive. Every time he closed his eyes, memories flooded back, not just of the ambush where Captain Chen had saved his unit, but of countless other moments from his tours. The bitter cold of the farmhouse brought back vivid recollections of nights spent in the Afghan mountains, where the temperature dropped so low it froze the oil in their vehicles. Back then, they'd had each other to rely on. Now, in his struggling farm, James felt the solitude more keenly than ever. Around midnight, the power went out, not an uncommon occurrence during winter storms. James lit the old oil lamps his grandfather had kept around, their warm glow casting dancing shadows on the walls. In that light, he pulled out his old military footlocker from beneath his bed. He hadn't opened it in years, but something about the evening's events compelled him to look inside. Among the items was a worn photograph, his unit posed in front of their vehicles, Captain Chen standing tall among them. James's finger traced the faces he still remembered so clearly. Martinez, who could fix any engine. Thompson, their medic, always ready with a joke. And Chen, their captain, who led from the front and never left anyone behind. The citation for his Purple Heart was there too, along with the commendation for the mission that had earned it. The official language was dry, clinical, but it couldn't capture the chaos of that day, the explosion that had caught their convoy, the firefight that followed, and Captain Chen's unexpected arrival with reinforcements just when all seemed lost. As the night wore on, James found himself at his kitchen table, writing in an old notebook by lamplight. He wrote about everything he'd never told anyone, the full story of the ambush, the rescue, the debt he felt he owed to Captain Chen. Something about giving away his father's coat, about meeting Tommy, had broken open a dam of memories he'd kept carefully contained for years. Dawn arrived with an eerie stillness. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. James's farm looked almost beautiful under its white blanket, masking the signs of struggle and decay. He made his morning coffee and stepped onto his porch, watching the sun rise over his frozen fields. The first unusual sign was the sound of vehicles in the distance. Unusual because the roads should have been impassable after the storm. Through his binoculars, James could see snowplows clearing the county road that led to his farm, working with an urgency that seemed out of place. His phone rang, the landline again. It was Bill Henderson, his closest neighbor. "James, Bill's voice was excited, almost frantic. "There's some kind of convoy headed your way. Military vehicles, looks like. What in God's name did you get yourself into?" Before James could respond, he heard it. The distinctive thump of helicopter rotors. The sound transported him instantly back to Afghanistan, to dusty landing zones and emergency evacuations. But this wasn't the desert. This was his farm in Montana. He stepped off his porch, ignoring the bite of the cold without his father's coat. The helicopter appeared over the tree line, sleek and black against the morning sky. It was a military craft, no doubt about it. An MH-60M. Blackhawk, the same type that had extracted his unit after the ambush. James stood straighter, his military bearing returning automatically as the aircraft approached. Snow swirled up from the ground as the helicopter descended toward his wheat field. Behind it, James could see vehicles approaching on the newly plowed road, black SUVs with government plates. His mind raced, trying to connect the dots. Tommy, Captain Chen, the rescue, his father's coat. Somehow it all had to be connected. The helicopter landed with practiced precision, its rotors slowing, but not stopping. The door slid open, and a figure emerged that made James's breath catch in his throat. Captain David Chen, now wearing the insignia of a full colonel, stepped onto the snow-covered ground. He looked older, grayer, but carried himself with the same quiet authority James remembered. Behind him came Tommy, bundled up in James's father's coat, and a woman James now recognized, Dr. Sarah Chen, one of the leading researchers in military medical technology. The pieces started falling into place in James's mind. He'd read about her work in developing cold weather survival gear for the military, though most of the details were classified. As they approached, James noticed others emerging from the helicopter and vehicles, men in suits, military personnel, all moving with the coordinated precision of a well-planned operation. This wasn't just a casual visit. This was something more. Colonel Chen reached him first, extending his hand. "Sergeant Miller," he said, his voice carrying clearly over the sound of the helicopter. "It seems I owe you another debt. First you saved my unit by holding that position until we could reach you, and now you save my son." James shook his hand, feeling the surreal nature of the moment. "Sir, I never got to thank you for the rescue. We would have been overrun if—" "That's actually why we're here," Colonel Chen interrupted, gesturing to the assembled group. "What you did last night, giving up your only protection against the cold to save someone else, it's exactly what we've been looking for. We need people who understand both the human element and the practical realities of survival." Dr. Chen stepped forward, still as graceful as James remembered from the base hospital. "We're developing new technologies for extreme weather survival," she explained. "But we need someone who's been there, who understands what works in real conditions, not just in laboratories. Someone who puts others first, no matter the cost to themselves." James looked at them all. The colonel who had saved his life, the boy wearing his father's coat, the helicopter waiting in his field. The morning sun glinted off the snow, making everything seem dreamlike, yet he knew this was very real. Something big was about to change in his life, and it had all started with giving away his father's coat to a freezing child. The helicopter's rotors continued their slow rotation, creating a gentle swirl of snow around them as Colonel Chen led James toward one of the black SUVs. The vehicle's interior was warm, a stark contrast to the bitter cold outside. Tommy had climbed in with them, still wearing James's father's coat, looking both excited and somewhat awed by the situation. "What you did last night," Colonel Chen began, "wasn't just about saving a boy lost in the snow. It demonstrated something we've been searching for." He pulled out a tablet, bringing up what looked like classified military documents. "Do you remember Project Winter Shield?" James felt his pulse quicken. Winter Shield had been a classified operation during his final tour, an attempt to develop new survival techniques for extreme weather conditions. His unit had been involved in testing some of the prototype gear, though most of the details had been above his pay grade. "The prototype gear we were testing," Dr. Chen continued, her voice carrying the precise tone of a scientist, showed promising results in the lab, but in the field, she glanced at her husband, then back to James. In real conditions, they failed. The technology wasn't the problem, it was our approach. We were focusing on the equipment, not on how people actually behave in survival situations. Colonel Chen nodded. That ambush where our paths crossed? It happened because our cold weather gear malfunctioned. Your unit should have frozen to death before we reached you, but you kept your men alive using improvised methods, techniques that weren't in any manual. James remembered that night vividly, how they'd huddled together, sharing body heat, using their knowledge of the local terrain to find shelter. We did what we had to do, sir. Nothing special about it. That's exactly what makes it special, Dr. Chen interjected. Your instincts, your practical experience. Last night proved you still have those skills. You didn't just give Tommy your coat. You knew exactly how to treat his hypothermia, how to warm him gradually, all the right protocols. The colonel reached into a briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. We're heading up a new division of Project Winter Shield. Not just developing survival gear, but creating comprehensive survival protocols based on real-world experience. We need someone who understands both the technical aspects and the human element. And you want me? James asked, still trying to process everything. We want you to head up our field testing division, Dr. Chen confirmed. Your farm would become our primary testing ground. Its isolation and weather conditions are perfect. We'd provide funding to restore it, modernize it, while maintaining its cover as a working farm. James looked out the window at his struggling farm, the fields that had been in his family for generations, the barn that needed repairs, the ancient tractor he could barely keep running. And what about the farming? Colonel Chen smiled. Keep farming. In fact, we want you to expand it. The best cover stories are the ones based in truth. But you'll also be helping save lives, developing survival techniques and gear that could help others who find themselves in situations like Tommy was in last night. The position comes with full military benefits, Dr. Chen added, including medical coverage for that leg injury we know still bothers you, plus a salary that would let you not just save the farm, but make it thrive again. Tommy, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. Dad says you're a hero, Mr. Miller, both for what you did in Afghanistan and for saving me. He says heroes like you shouldn't have to struggle. James felt emotion well up in his throat. He looked at his father's coat on Tommy's shoulders, thinking about how his father would have handled this moment. The old man had always said that opportunity comes dressed in work clothes. You just had to be willing to recognize it. There's more, Colonel Chen said, pulling out another document. We found out about your father's service record. Did you know he was part of the original cold weather survival program in Korea? The coat you gave Tommy, it was actually a prototype, one of the first attempts at creating advanced cold weather gear disguised as ordinary clothing. James stared at the coat in disbelief. All these years, he'd never known. His father had never mentioned it, had worn it like any other farm coat. But now he remembered how it had always kept him surprisingly warm, how it had survived decades of use without falling apart. Your father was part of something bigger, Dr. Chen said gently. And now, you have the chance to continue that legacy, to help create the next generation of survival gear that could save countless lives. Through the SUV's window, James could see more vehicles arriving, equipment trucks, mobile command units, all parking carefully around his farm. This wasn't just a job offer. This was a chance to make his family's legacy mean something more, to combine everything he'd learned as a soldier and a farmer into something that could help others. The choice is yours, Colonel Chen said. But we need an answer soon. We have teams ready to begin setting up as soon as you give the word. James looked at Tommy again, at his father's coat, at the farm that had been both his burden and his anchor. He thought about all the other people who might find themselves lost in the cold, about soldiers operating in extreme conditions, about the chance to make a real difference. When do we start? He asked, his voice firm with decision. Colonel Chen smiled, extending his hand. Welcome back to service, Sergeant Miller. This time, we're going to change the game entirely. The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of activity that transformed James's quiet farm into what looked like a military operation base. Equipment trucks began unloading sophisticated weather monitoring stations, mobile research units, and testing facilities. Teams of personnel moved with practiced efficiency, setting up equipment in the barn that had only yesterday held his 2 dairy cows. James watched from his porch, still trying to process how dramatically his life had changed in just 24 hours. Dr. Chen stood beside him, explaining the various installations and their purposes. The old barn, she explained, would become a state-of-the-art cold weather testing facility, while still maintaining its outward appearance as a working farm building. Your animals will stay, she assured him, noticing his concern as he watched his cows being led to a new, heated enclosure. In fact, we'll be bringing in more. A working farm is the perfect cover for what we're doing here. Plus, the agricultural data we gather will help with developing survival techniques for rural communities during extreme weather events. Colonel Chen was coordinating the operation from a mobile command center they'd set up near the house. He called James over to show him the master plan for the facility. The detailed blueprints showed how they would integrate cutting-edge technology while preserving the farm's authentic appearance. Look here, the colonel pointed to a section of the plans. Underground testing chambers beneath your fields. They'll allow us to simulate various extreme weather conditions without raising suspicion. To anyone passing by, it will still look like ordinary farmland. Tommy had stayed, his father allowing him to miss school for the day to watch the transformation. He still wore James's father's coat, and now sat at the kitchen table where James had spent so many nights worrying about bills. The boy was examining the coat with new interest, knowing its historical significance. Your grandfather was brilliant, Dr. Chen said, joining them at the table. The principles he used in designing this coat were still discovering new applications for them. She gently turned over one of the sleeves, pointing to nearly invisible seams. See these patterns? They're not decorative. They're part of an advanced heat retention system that was decades ahead of its time. James ran his fingers over the familiar fabric, seeing it with new eyes. All those years of his father wearing it in the fields, never mentioning its true nature, its importance. Why didn't he ever say anything? He wondered aloud. Colonel Chen, who had followed them inside, answered. Some of the best innovations come from people who don't seek recognition. Your father understood that sometimes the most effective solutions are the ones that don't draw attention to themselves. The day continued with a flurry of additional arrivals. Scientists, engineers, and military personnel, all experts in their fields, each bringing another piece of what would become a comprehensive research and development facility. James met them all, trying to absorb the vast amount of information being shared. Dr. Martinez, a climatologist, showed him the weather monitoring systems they were installing. These will give us data far beyond what standard weather stations collect, she explained. We'll be able to predict and prepare for extreme weather events days in advance. Captain Roberts, a survival training expert, walked the property with James, discussing how different areas could be used for various scenarios. Your land has perfect terrain variations, he noted. Hills, flatlands, wooded areas. We couldn't have designed a better testing ground if we'd tried. As evening approached, James found himself back on his porch, watching the sunset cast long shadows across his transformed farm. The familiar view was now dotted with new structures, vehicles, and equipment, yet somehow it still felt like home. Perhaps even more so, now that it had a greater purpose. Tommy finally had to leave, reluctantly preparing to return the coat. But James stopped him. Keep it, he said firmly. It's part of history now, and you're part of its story. Just promise you'll take good care of it. The boy's eyes lit up. Really? But what about you? Colonel Chen stepped forward, carrying a large case. We thought you might say that, James. He opened the case to reveal a new coat, similar in appearance to his father's, but clearly incorporating the latest technology. The first prototype of our new line, based on your father's original design but with some significant upgrades. As James slipped on the new coat, he could feel the difference. It was lighter, more flexible, yet somehow even warmer than his father's had been. Dr. Chen explained the various features: advanced temperature regulation, built-in emergency signaling systems, and materials that could adapt to changing weather conditions. "This is just the beginning," she said, her excitement evident. "With your experience and our resources, we're going to revolutionize cold weather survival gear. And not just for the military. Eventually, this technology will help civilians too. Search and rescue teams, emergency responders, anyone who might find themselves facing extreme conditions." As the day's light faded, James stood in his kitchen, now transformed into a temporary command center, and looked at a framed photo of his father. The old man was standing proud in front of the barn, wearing that special coat, his eyes twinkling with a secret James now understood. "Your father would be proud," Colonel Chen said quietly, joining him. "You're not just preserving his legacy, you're building on it, taking what he started and using it to help others on a scale he could only have dreamed of." 1 week into the transformation, James's farm had become virtually unrecognizable from the inside, while maintaining its humble appearance from the outside. The barn, though still weathered and rustic on the exterior, now housed millions of dollars worth of testing equipment. His fields, covered in snow, concealed a network of underground research facilities that rivaled military installations. Each morning brought new discoveries and challenges. James found himself drawing on both his farming experience and military training as he worked with the research team. His practical knowledge proved invaluable as they developed and tested new survival gear, his insights often solving problems that had stumped even the most experienced scientists. "See, that's the thing about cold," James explained to a group of engineers one morning, as they tested a new thermal regulation system. "It's not just about temperature, it's about how people actually behave when they're freezing. You can have the best gear in the world, but if it's too complicated to use with numb fingers, it's useless in a real emergency." The team was currently working on what they called Project Heritage, a line of survival gear disguised as ordinary clothing, inspired by his father's coat. Dr. Chen had been right. The principles used in the original coat were revolutionary, and with modern technology, they could take those ideas even further. Tommy visited regularly, becoming something of a mascot for the project. He wore his inherited coat proudly, and the scientists often used him as a test subject for their child-sized prototypes. The boy's natural curiosity and honest feedback proved surprisingly valuable in their development process. "The thing about kids," James told Colonel Chen one afternoon, "is that they'll tell you exactly what's wrong with something. No diplomatic sugarcoating. We need that kind of honesty when lives are at stake." The colonel had become a regular presence at the farm, overseeing the operation, but also sharing stories about the ambush that had first connected their paths. James finally learned the full story of what had happened after he'd been evacuated, how Chen had used the experience to push for better cold weather gear, leading eventually to this project. "Everything connects," the colonel said, watching a test of their latest prototype. "Your father's coat, the ambush, Tommy getting lost in the storm. It's like all these threads were waiting to be woven together." The local community had accepted the changes with typical rural discretion. The cover story, that the farm had received a government grant for agricultural research, was accepted without much question. If anyone noticed the sophisticated equipment being delivered or the unusual number of vehicles coming and going, they kept their observations to themselves. James's sister Martha finally visited, bringing her famous apple pie and 1,000 questions. He told her as much as he could, and she seemed to understand what he couldn't say. "Dad would love this," she said, looking around the modernized farm. "His practical nature combined with all this science. It's perfect." 1 month into the project, they had their first real test. A severe blizzard hit the region, stranding several families in their cars on the highway. The local search and rescue team, now equipped with prototype gear from the farm, was able to reach them all safely. James watched the rescue operation from the command center, feeling a deep satisfaction as the technology they'd developed helped save lives. "This is what it's all about," Dr. Chen said, standing beside him as they monitored the rescue. "Not just developing the technology, but seeing it make a real difference." The farm itself was thriving. With the project's resources, James was able to repair and upgrade everything. The fields were ready for spring planting, the livestock areas were modernized while maintaining their rustic appearance, and even the old farmhouse had been carefully renovated, though from the outside it still looked like the same humble home it had always been. Late one evening, as James sat on his porch watching the sun set over his transformed property, Tommy appeared with his father's coat and a question. "Mr. Miller," he asked, "do you ever miss your old life? You know, when things were simpler?" James thought about it, looking out over the fields where advanced weather monitoring equipment was disguised as ordinary farming tools. He thought about his father, about the secret he'd carried in the form of a simple coat, about how helping others had always been the family's true legacy. "Life's never really simple, Tommy," he finally replied. "My father taught me that every day on this farm. The difference now is that we're doing more with what we have. The farm's still a farm. We're just growing more than crops now. We're growing ideas that can save lives." Colonel Chen, who had been approaching the porch, overheard the conversation. "That's what makes this project special," he added. "It's not just about the technology. It's about combining the wisdom of people who work the land with the latest scientific advances. People like your father, James, understood things about survival that you can't learn in a laboratory." As if to emphasize the point, a test alert sounded from the barn, another prototype ready for evaluation. James stood, putting on his new coat, its advanced technology hidden within its humble appearance, just like everything else on the farm. "Time to get back to work," he said, with a smile. "Those storms aren't going to wait for us to be ready. We need to be ready for them." As winter turned to spring, the impact of Project Heritage began to extend far beyond James's farm. The first batch of production models based on his father's original coat design but enhanced with modern technology had been distributed to search and rescue teams across 3 states. The results were already exceeding expectations. In Montana's Glacier National Park, a team wearing the new gear had managed to rescue a group of stranded hikers during a sudden spring snowstorm. The rescuers reported that the adaptive thermal technology had allowed them to work comfortably in conditions that would have normally forced them to turn back. James had listened to their radio transmissions from the farm's command center, his chest tight with pride. "Your father's design saved those people," Dr. Chen said, reviewing the data from the rescue. "The way the coat adapts to changing conditions, the intuitive design that works even when the user is under stress. These were all principles he understood decades ago." The farm itself had become a hub of innovation, though you'd never know it from the road. Crops were growing in the fields as always, but now they concealed a network of sensors that provided valuable data about ground conditions and temperature variations. The old barn still housed farm equipment, but behind its weathered walls, scientists worked on the next generation of survival gear. One morning, as James was checking the new spring wheat sprouts, a familiar helicopter appeared on the horizon. This time it carried General Matthews, the head of the entire cold weather survival program. James had met him briefly during the initial setup, but this visit was different. The general had news. "Congress just approved expanded funding," Matthews announced in the command center, spreading out documents on the table. "Your success here has convinced them to scale up the program. We want to establish similar facilities in Alaska and the Rockies using this farm as the model." James listened as the general outlined the expansion plans. Each new facility would maintain the same cover, working farms that concealed cutting-edge research operations. But what caught his attention was something else entirely. "We want you to oversee the training program," the general continued. "Your background, farming, military service, practical experience, makes you uniquely qualified to teach others how to run these facilities. Plus, your insight into how to maintain the balance between operational security and agricultural authenticity is invaluable." Tommy, who still visited regularly after school, was there for the announcement. He'd become something of an unofficial junior researcher, his youth and enthusiasm bringing fresh perspective to their work. "Does this mean Mr. Miller will be famous?" he asked, still wearing the original coat that had started it all. The general chuckled. "No, son. The best kind of hero is the one nobody knows about, just like Mr. Miller's father, who wore this coat for years without ever telling anyone what it really was." The meeting continued with detailed discussions about the expansion. Dr. Chen presented data showing how the technology they'd developed had already saved dozens of lives. Colonel Chen added reports from military units testing specialized versions of their gear in some of the world's harshest environments. Later that evening, after the helicopter had departed and the day's work was done, James sat in his kitchen with Tommy and his parents. The room still looked like a simple farmhouse kitchen, though now it concealed enough technology to run a small military base. "I never properly thanked you," Colonel Chen said, "for what you did that night in the storm, not just saving Tommy but showing us what real survival instincts look like. We had all this technology, all these theories, but you reminded us that sometimes the simplest solutions are the best." Dr. Chen added, "The way you gave up your only protection against the cold without hesitation. That's the kind of thing we can't teach in a laboratory, but we can design gear that makes it easier for others to help people without putting themselves at risk." James looked at his father's coat, still warm and serviceable on Tommy's shoulders after all these years. "My father used to say that the true value of anything is in how it helps others. I never knew he was talking about more than just farming." The next day brought another breakthrough. The team had successfully tested a new material that could generate heat using only body movement, integrated so seamlessly into ordinary-looking clothing that it was impossible to detect. James watched the test results with satisfaction, remembering cold nights in Afghanistan when such technology could have saved lives. "We're not just developing gear," he told his team during their evening briefing. "We're creating tools that give people the confidence to help others. When someone's stranded in a storm, every minute counts. Having the right equipment means not having to choose between helping and staying safe yourself." As spring progressed, the farm flourished both above and below ground. The wheat grew tall, concealing the testing facilities beneath. The barn continued its double life as both agricultural building and research center. And James found himself growing into his new role, bridging the gap between the practical world of farming and the advanced technology they were developing. 1 year had passed since that stormy night when he'd given away his father's coat. The farm had changed. His life had changed, but the core principle remained the same, helping others just in a bigger way than before. As he watched another sunset from his porch, James realized that some of the best things in life come disguised as simple choices, like giving a coat to a freezing child on a cold winter night. A year and a half after that fateful winter night, James stood in his modernized barn, now a seamless blend of agricultural functionality and cutting-edge research. The original structure remained, but inside it housed some of the most advanced weather survival technology in the world. He was preparing for an important demonstration, the first major review of Project Heritage's achievements. The occasion had brought together an unprecedented gathering of military officials, scientists, and rescue personnel. Even more remarkably, for the first time, they'd received clearance to share some of their developments with selected civilian emergency response teams. The farm's cover remained intact, but today it would show its true capabilities. "It all started with this, Doctor." Chen began the presentation, holding up Tommy's coat, the original prototype that James's father had worn for so many years. The assembled group leaned forward, many of them hearing the full story for the first time. A piece of technology so well disguised that it served as an ordinary farm coat for decades while containing innovations we're still learning from today. James took over, his quiet farmer's voice carrying the weight of experience. "What my father understood and what we've built upon is that the best survival gear shouldn't just work well. It should work naturally. When you're fighting against extreme conditions, every action needs to be intuitive." The demonstration began with a simulation in their underground testing facility. They had recreated the conditions from the night Tommy had gotten lost, with winds and snow generated by state-of-the-art weather systems. Volunteers wearing their latest prototypes demonstrated how the gear, adapted automatically to changing conditions. Watch closely, James pointed out. The material responds to body temperature and external conditions without any user input. Just like my father's coat, it looks ordinary, but provides extraordinary protection. Colonel Chen added his perspective from the military trials. We've tested this technology in some of the most extreme environments on Earth. The results have exceeded all expectations. But more importantly, we've maintained the principle of simplicity that Sergeant Miller and his father championed. The presentation continued with video footage from actual rescues where their gear had made the difference. Search and rescue teams testified about how the technology had expanded their operational capabilities. Military units reported increased survival rates in extreme conditions. But it was the testimony from civilian first responders that really drove home the impact of their work. Sarah Martinez, a paramedic from Colorado, shared her experience. Last month, we rescued a family stranded in a blizzard. With traditional gear, we would have had maybe 20 minutes of operational time in those conditions. With this new equipment, we worked for over 2 hours, saving not just the family, but their elderly grandparents as well. Tommy, now in high school but still a regular presence at the farm, had been given special permission to attend. He still wore the original coat on his visits, though he'd grown considerably since that first night. During breaks in the presentation, he helped explain to visitors how the farm maintained its dual identity. "See those fields?" he would say, pointing out the window. "They're real wheat, but they also hide sensors that help us understand how cold air moves across the landscape. Mr. Miller says the best cover story is one that's actually true. We really are farming. We're just farming more than crops." The afternoon session focused on the future. Dr. Chen unveiled plans for expanding the program, including new facilities modeled after James's farm. Each location will maintain agricultural operations while conducting research and development. It's a model that works because it's authentic. Real farms doing real work while advancing our understanding of survival technology. James found himself thinking about his father throughout the day. What would the old man think of how his secret coat had spawned all this? The farm that had been struggling to survive was now thriving, both as an agricultural operation and as a center for life-saving research. Later that evening, after the visitors had departed, James sat with Colonel Chen and Tommy on the porch, a tradition they'd maintained since the project began. The sun was setting over fields that now concealed some of the most advanced weather monitoring systems in the world. "Your father was a visionary," the colonel said, watching the colors paint the sky. He understood something we often forget in the military, that the best solutions don't always look like solutions. Sometimes they look like an old farm coat. Tommy, who had been unusually quiet, spoke up. "Mr. Miller, remember when you gave me this coat? You didn't know what it really was then, but you gave it away anyway. That's what makes all this work, isn't it? It's not just the technology, it's the willingness to help others." James nodded, touched by the boy's insight. The farm had changed dramatically in the past year and a half, but its heart remained the same. Whether it was growing food to feed people or developing technology to save them, the core mission hadn't changed, helping others, making a difference, carrying on a legacy that was bigger than any one person. "Tomorrow," James said, "we go back to being just another farm as far as the world is concerned. And that's exactly how it should be. The best kind of help doesn't draw attention to itself. It just works when it's needed most." 2 years had passed since that winter night when James had given away his father's coat. The farm had settled into its dual identity, a working agricultural operation on the surface and a crucial research facility underneath. Spring had come early this year, and the wheat fields were already showing promise, both for their crop yield and the valuable weather data they collected. One crisp morning, James stood in his father's old study, now subtly modified to serve as his personal command center. Photos lined the walls, his father in the original coat, his unit from Afghanistan, the research team, and most recently, a group photo from the first graduation of their specialized training program for other facility operators. The morning's reports were encouraging. 3 more farms across the country had been converted into research stations following their model. Each maintained actual agricultural operations while developing and testing new survival technology. The program had saved hundreds of lives already, from stranded hikers to military personnel operating in extreme conditions. Tommy, now preparing for college, had become an unofficial spokesman for the program to selected audiences. His story, of getting lost in the storm and receiving the historic coat, had become part of the project's lore. More importantly, he'd developed a keen interest in engineering, inspired by the technology he'd watched evolve over the past 2 years. "I want to study materials science," he told James during one of his regular visits. "Dr. Chen says there's still so much we can learn from your father's coat. Maybe I can help develop the next generation of survival gear." The coat itself had been carefully preserved, though Tommy still wore it on special occasions. Scientists had thoroughly studied its design, amazed by its elegant solutions to complex problems. James's father had been decades ahead of his time, creating technology that looked like tradition. That morning, James had a special visitor. General Matthews had returned, this time with news that would bring everything full circle. As they walked the property, the general explained the latest development. "Congress has approved the establishment of a permanent research and training facility," he said, pausing to look over the fields. "They want to name it after your father, the Miller Center for Agricultural Innovation and Survival Technology. It will oversee all the farm facilities and coordinate future developments." James absorbed this information, watching a tractor work in the distance. Real agricultural work happening above sophisticated testing chambers. "My father never wanted recognition," he said quietly. "That's exactly why he deserves it," the general replied. "He understood that true innovation often comes disguised as something simple. This center will carry on that philosophy." Later that day, Colonel Chen and his wife arrived with more detailed plans. The center would be built underground, expanding the existing facility beneath James's farm. Above ground, everything would remain unchanged, a working farm, continuing its essential agricultural mission while harboring its deeper purpose. "We've learned so much from your approach," Dr. Chen explained, spreading out the blueprints. "The other facilities are successful because they follow your example, maintaining authentic agricultural operations while advancing the technology. It's not just a cover story. It's a fundamental part of how we understand survival in extreme conditions." As they discussed the plans, Tommy arrived from school, still wearing the historic coat. He joined them at the table, now able to contribute meaningfully to technical discussions about materials and design. James watched him with pride, seeing how one act of kindness had shaped the boy's entire future. That evening, after everyone had left, James walked his fields alone. The wheat was growing strong, sensors hidden beneath the soil continuously gathering data that would help save lives. His father's legacy lived on in ways the old man could never have imagined, yet would have deeply understood. The sun was setting when James heard the familiar sound of helicopter rotors. Another test flight was returning, bringing data from cold weather trials in the Rockies. As he watched the aircraft land in what had become a well-used landing zone, he thought about how much had changed since that first shocking arrival 2 years ago. This was more than just a research facility now. It was a bridge between the practical wisdom of farmers who had worked the land for generations and the latest advances in survival technology. It was a place where his father's simple coat had revolutionized how they thought about protecting people in extreme conditions. As darkness fell, James returned to his farmhouse. The porch light still illuminated the same rocking chair where his father used to sit, though now it overlooked a farm that was at the forefront of saving lives. Inside, the house remained humble, though it now concealed enough technology to coordinate rescue operations across the continent. Looking at his father's photograph one last time before heading to bed, James smiled. The old man had always said that the true value of anything was in how it helped others. He'd lived that principle quietly, wearing an advanced survival coat as if it were ordinary farm wear, helping others without drawing attention to himself. Now that legacy continued. In the fields that grew both wheat and data, in the barn that sheltered both tractors and testing facilities, in the young minds like Tommy's that would carry this work into the future, and in every life saved by technology that looked as humble as an old farm coat. Some nights, when the wind blew cold across the fields, James could almost feel his father's presence, approving of how his secret mission had grown into something far greater. The farm was still a farm, but it had become something more, a place where simple acts of kindness could spark revolutions in saving lives, all hidden beneath the sturdy disguise of honest, hard work. And that, James knew, was exactly how it should be.